Hey friends, welcome back to another video. My name is Emma Lefebvre, and today I am doing a medium comparison video where I am painting the same painting with watercolor, gouache, and acrylic to show you the differences of how you use them and how they look. So let's jump right in and get started. Okay friends, so for today's video, I want to do something a little different. I want to do a comparison of the same painting using watercolor, gouache, and acrylic, and then kind of show you the differences on how to approach using these different mediums and the different outcomes of how they actually look. So first, I'm just kind of doing this pen drawing of the painting that we're going to actually do. We are going to do a little vase with some hydrangeas. And this is a really fun one because there's a lot of shading in it, and there's going to be some bold colors, and I just really want to show you the differences in these mediums and how to go about using them. Now, I am not an expert in gouache or acrylic. Watercolor is my thing, but I do have a few, inside tips on how to use both. They may not be right for everybody, but I'm just going to show you how I use them. Okay, so first I am sketching out this hydrangea vase again with my pencil, and when you are doing this for watercolor, you probably can't see it. It's very, very light. I used a very light pencil sketch, and then I even erased it to make sure you can't see underneath it. Now, the thing you need to know about watercolor is a transparent medium, which means you can see through it. So if there's any pencil lines down on the paper, you will most likely be able to see them underneath. This is what also makes it different from gouache and acrylic. Now, the other huge thing you need to know about watercolor is when you're working with watercolor, you need to work light to dark. Because it is a transparent medium, it's very hard to layer lighter colors on top of darker colors. It is possible if you use some white watercolor. That is an option where you can make it a little bit more opaque, or there are some opaque paint colors, but ultimately what you want to practice is working light to dark. So you saw I painted both hydrangeas as a ball using the lightest value of color to lay that down, and then I start to layer on top the darker color. So working light to dark is very, very important with watercolor. Another huge and important tip that you need to know when working with watercolor is your paint will react differently to whether your paper underneath is still wet or if it's dry. If your paper is still dry, like when I was adding in the darker values of the hydrangea flowers to those original balls, you can see they're a little bit more blurred out. That is because my paper, that little area, was wet to start with. So adding a wet color on top of a wet surface, you're going to get more blurred kind of lines and spots. If you want more structured lines, you are going to want to work on a dry paper. So at one point, I hope you saw that I used a little dryer. That will dry that layer, so the next marks that I do on top, the next layers, are going to be sharper. So see how I'm adding that darker shadow right now? That's all still wet. So you're seeing a more blurred out effect with that shadow, which you'll see I fix it up a couple times because I don't really like it, and it can be quite tricky to work on. But it is one of the most unique things about this paint medium is that you can work wet on wet and get a different effect rather than other mediums where you might not have the same. If you work wet on wet with acrylic, your paint's still wet, it's not the same. It's not going to react the same. Watercolor is very, very different. Gouache is similar, but watercolor has this magic to it when you are working wet on wet or even wet on dry for layers. So here you can see I'm going back into that hydrangea on the shadow side. That hydrangea is dry, so you're seeing sharper, more defined marks rather than that blurry effect that we did on the first one. You can see the difference right there between the blue hydrangea and the purple one. You get more defined marks when you are working in layers on a dry surface rather than a wet surface. And that's really what makes watercolor so unique to other mediums. Now, like I said, gouache can be similar, which I will show you, but with watercolor, I honestly feel like there's really nothing like it. Now, one thing about watercolor is you can kind of see it dries a little bit lighter, so you might need to work in layers to get the same kind of saturation that you will with the other ones. You can see here I'm kind of trying to figure out the shadow, but it's just something you need to work on, and I do eventually figure it out. Okay, so now let's move on to gouache. So gouache is like if acrylic and watercolor had a baby. That's kind of the gist of it. Gouache can be reactivated with water. So like watercolor, which I totally forgot to mention, if you have some gouache on your palette and you add water to it, it will reactivate and you can use that paint again. Okay, you can use it from dry just by reactivating it with water. So that's where it is similar to watercolor. The way it is kind of similar to acrylic is that it is a very opaque medium. So here it actually looks a little bit more similar to watercolor because I've watered it down quite a bit to get this base layer. With gouache, you do want to work in layers as well. The difference is, unlike watercolor, is that you can work dark to light. So watercolor, you want to lay down all your lighter values first and then layer the darker ones because it's transparent. Gouache, you can go right in with your darker colors and then layer lighter highlights on top because it is opaque. Here, I did work a little bit more lighter to dark because I just kind of want to develop those shadows over, but then you will see towards the end of the painting, I do layer some lighter petals using a lighter mixture of white and whatever color I used for the flowers on top to get those lighter values, those highlights. So you can do that, unlike watercolor. Yes, you can use white watercolor, but I still don't feel like it's as opaque. See here, I'm adding some lighter petals right there. That is the beauty of gouache, is that you don't have to work light to dark and just place in the shadows. You can do that, but you can also layer those lighter colors on top because it is opaque. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. And one other thing I really love about gouache is its matte finish. You'll see once I lay the background down, the blue kind of wall behind it, it just has this beautiful even matte finish to it, which I really love the effect. I find it just looks the most vibrant, and I just love the look of gouache. Even these flowers, because I'm able to layer those highlights on the leaves you can see and on the petals, it just seems to pop off the page a little bit more. So that's such a benefit when working with this medium, is that you can layer those lighter colors on top. So like I said, you can reactivate it with water even if your palette dries up. You just add a little bit of water. The only thing with that is that if you have squeezed a bunch of gouache onto your palette and then you reactivate it later on, it can be a little bit more watered down. You might have to mix more or add more paint to it, but it does reactivate just like watercolor does. But then it has this beautiful thickness to it, an opaqueness that just kind of makes it jump right off the page. The one thing I still find tricky about using gouache that I'm still trying to figure out is paint consistency. So I have been painting with watercolor for a very long time. It just becomes second nature to me of how much water to paint ratio to use. Gouache is a little trickier because the more water you use, the more transparent it is, and the more paint you use, the thicker it is. But you also have to take into consideration if you have a thick layer at the base and then you paint on top of it, it can reactivate that paint underneath. So there are a lot of factors that go into learning how to use gouache, which I'm still trying to figure out, but it is such a beautiful medium to really give a try. So that's my little rundown about gouache. I think we need to start talking about our last one, which is acrylic. Okay, so acrylic paint. I feel like the majority of us started out painting with acrylic. You know, that's one of the first paints you give your kids. And for this painting, I'm using Liquitex soft body acrylic paint. Most of it's dried up. Honestly, I don't use it as often as maybe I should, but it's definitely the first paint, not brand, not these actual paints, but the first type of medium I started out with. And even though I don't feel the most comfortable with it because it's been so long, but I feel like it's kind of straightforward because this is what most of us learn to paint with. So like gouache, you can work dark to light, you can lighten it up and add highlights because it is an opaque paint. So there isn't too much room for error because most of the time you can cover it up. I have in the past so many times, like look at what I'm laying down right now. These colors do not go, but I just keep layering over top because you can, and it's opaque and it doesn't really make a difference. You just keep layering all those mistakes, but layering over those mistakes. But there are so many times where I have painted a painting and I've hated it or parts of it, and I can just paint right over it. So that's a huge benefit with acrylic. It is pretty forgiving. I will say that watercolor is also very forgiving. You just need to know how to fix little issues you may have with it. But acrylic is kind of like a no fuss paint. You can really just paint over things that don't work and work how you like. So here I am doing the same kind of thing as I did with the gouache. I'm working kind of not dark to light, but medium to light. Because it is so opaque, you can do that. Now, the thing with acrylic paint, and which is why I kind of stopped using it, was because I had a baby. And no, it does not harm the baby. But the thing with acrylic is that once you put your paint on that palette, if you do not use it, you lose it. It dries up, and it dries up fast. So me trying to, you know, paint in little sessions while my son was napping and, you know, try and squeeze in as much as I could without wasting paint was impossible. I couldn't just get up and walk away and tend to him and then come back and continue going like I could with watercolor. That's one of the beauties of watercolors and gouache, but I didn't discover that till later. But with watercolor is that you can just leave it. You can leave all of your stuff right there, walk away for an hour or two and come right back and continue. Acrylic, there's a lot more of a mess and a fuss to clean up, and if you don't use your paint or put it away properly, it will dry up. So that is why I don't use acrylic as much anymore. It's just too much of an ordeal, and as a mom of 2 kids, even now, it's just too much. I just can't use it. Maybe later on I'll get back into it, but I've really fallen in love with watercolor and gouache that I don't feel like I would use it. So one thing I do use acrylic for, if I am going to use it, I paint my son's school shoes, little characters and stuff that he loves. So I will use that because it is permanent. You cannot reactivate it with water, like I said, so it will stay there. I love painting canvas shoes with this paint, especially this soft body acrylic by Liquitex. I find it's really nice and permanent, but it is permanent. So I've ruined many pairs of pants with acrylic paint. But yeah, that's the thing, is that you can't reactivate it. It doesn't really wash out too well. So once it's on there, it's on there. That's either a benefit or a negative, depending on who you are and what you're using it for. But it does look really nice. It gives, I find it doesn't look as matte and as flat as gouache. So it gives a bit more of a textured vibe, which I'm okay with at times. But to me, I just gravitate more towards the gouache, the matteness of it, the look of it. But I'd love to hear your guys' opinion in the description below. The comments below. I feel like a lot of us started with this paint and maybe feel more comfortable using acrylics. So I want to hear from you guys, watching all of these paintings kind of unfold and seeing which ones you like the best. Now here you can see my watercolor one in comparison to the other two just was too light and just wasn't full of the same saturation as the other 2 mediums. So again, beauty of watercolor, you can go right over top of that and increase the saturation by doing another layer. And you might have to do that a few times with watercolor. Here I'm also adding a little bit more of the white watercolor on top just for a bit more of the detail, but you can see it's not as, doesn't stand out as much as the other 2 mediums. And then just lighting up the back. One other thing I love about watercolor, which I'm going to show you quickly, is the effects that you can get with it. Here I just added a little bit of salt to the background, and watercolor I find can do so many incredible things. You just have to play around and try. And here I'm layering more to get more depth and more detail, which I love about watercolor. So let me know in the comments below, which one is your favorite? Which one do you gravitate towards more so with just looking at these different paintings, but also which one looks like it's maybe the most user-friendly for you? And then lastly, I just want to know which one of these mediums do you want a real-time tutorial on of this painting? Because I know this was kind of fast. I'd love to slow it down and explain it properly. Let me know in the comments below. Can't wait to hear your thoughts. Thank you all so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and follow me on all my other platforms for tons more content. Have a great day, guys. Bye.